London, Waterloo Bridge, September 7, 1978. A typical evening rush hour when grey fog mixes with the exhaust fumes of cabs and double-decker buses. A man standing at a bus stop feels a slight prick in the back of his thigh. It feels like an insect bite or an accidental bump with someone's umbrella in a dense crowd. He turns around and sees a retreating figure who mutters apologies with a foreign accent and quickly dissolves into the crowd, diving into a taxi. The victim, Bulgarian dissident Georgy Markov, does not yet know that he has less than 4 days to live. He does not know that a microscopic capsule of platinum and iridium containing ricin, a substance for which doctors have no antidote, has already begun to act in his body. This episode on the London Bridge became perhaps the most famous public demonstration of a power that, until then, had only been whispered about in the most private offices of Western intelligence agencies. This was the handwriting of ghosts. This was the work of specialists whose existence was officially denied at all levels. We are talking about a structure that, within the most powerful special service of the Soviet Union, was considered both elite and outcast. This is a story about those who carried out sentences when diplomacy fell silent. To understand the nature of this phenomenon, we need to move from rainy London to the center of Moscow, to Lubyanka Square, but not to the ceremonial offices, but deep into the intricate corridors of a building that inspired awe with its very shadow. In an era commonly referred to as stagnation, the world seemed to be frozen in a fragile balance. Nuclear parity kept the superpowers from direct confrontation, and politicians signed arms limitation treaties. But beneath this icy crust of stability, an invisible war raged, where the rules of the Geneva Conventions did not apply. The Soviet Union, striving to maintain its influence and neutralize threats, created a tool of surgical precision. If, during the time of Joseph Stalin, terror was massive and loud, like a sledgehammer blow, then in the 70s of the 20th century, it transformed into a scalpel. It was for such tasks that the 13th Department, later reorganized into the 8th Department of Directorate S, operated as part of the first main directorate of the Committee for State Security. In professional jargon, their work was called active measures. But behind this dry, bureaucratic term lay a reality associated with sabotage, subversion, and the physical elimination of undesirable persons. These people were not just spies stealing blueprints or recruiting diplomats. They were the executors of final decisions. The creation of this unit was a response to the changing geopolitical map. By the mid-60s, it became clear that open military conflicts were fraught with global catastrophe. War went into the shadows. Specialists were needed who could operate autonomously anywhere in the world, capable of disabling a power plant in New York, poisoning the water supply system in a major European city, or quietly eliminating a defector who knew too much. The 13th Department became the heir to the legendary and ominous Myronovsky Laboratory, where as early as the 30s, poisons were tested on those sentenced to the highest measure. However, in the era of Leonid Brezhnev, the methods became more sophisticated. Brute force gave way to technologies that even today seem like science fiction. This was an industry of quiet neutralization put on a state-sponsored conveyor belt. Every employee of this department underwent a selection process whose rigor is difficult to imagine. These were people with a unique psychotype, capable of living a double life for years, maintaining absolute composure and at the same time possessing the intellect of a chess player. The external activities of the department were shrouded in a dense veil of disinformation. For the average citizen of the Soviet Union, as well as for most employees of the committee itself, their work was a myth. But behind the closed doors of laboratories and at secret testing grounds in Balashika, work was buzzing. Engineers and chemists created tools that were not supposed to leave traces. The arsenal of the liquidators included not only silenced pistols, silent shooting pens, cigarette packs capable of emitting a stream of cyanide, and, of course, the famous umbrellas with a pneumatic mechanism were developed there. One of the main tasks of the technical personnel was to create situations that would appear to be a natural course of events. A heart attack in a healthy 40-year-old man? It happens. A sudden car accident on an empty road? A tragic accident. Falling out of a window in a state of depression? A sad outcome. The skill of the 13th Department lay precisely in transforming the violent cessation of life into a statistical error that would not raise questions from the police and pathologists. However, behind the technical perfection and cold professionalism lay a deep internal conflict that tore apart the participants in this process. Working in the Wet Affairs Department required a special deformation of personality. Imagine a person who kisses his wife in the morning, sees his children off to school, discusses vacation plans in Crimea, and then goes to work where he plans a complex operation to eliminate a person in another country. This required colossal psychological repression. Many employees sincerely believed that they were soldiers of the invisible front, the shield of the homeland. The ideological indoctrination was powerful. They were instilled with the idea that eliminating one traitor or enemy strategist saved thousands of lives of Soviet citizens. This was the logic of the lesser evil, elevated to an absolute. But even the strongest armor cracks. History knows examples of officers who, unable to bear the burden of what they had done, sought an escape. In alcohol, in cynicism, or in betrayal. This internal breakdown was most vividly manifested in the fate of Bogdan Stashinsky, the man who liquidated the leader of Ukrainian nationalists, Stepan Bandera. Although his actions occurred during the period preceding the flourishing of stagnation, his shadow hung over the 13th Department for decades. Stashinsky, armed with a special syringe pistol spraying cyanide, carried out the assignment flawlessly. The victim inhaled the poison vapors and died of heart paralysis, which looked like a natural death. But the perpetrator himself, after receiving the Order of the Red Banner of Battle, broke down. The realization that he had become merely an instrument, a mechanism for murder, led him to decide to flee to the West and reveal everything. His escape and subsequent testimony in the Karlsruhe court were a shock to the system. This forced the committee's leadership to radically revise its tactics. After the Stashinsky scandal, direct liquidations began to be approved at the highest level, up to the General Secretary. The risk of political scandal began to outweigh the tactical advantage. Nevertheless, the machine did not stop. It only became more cautious. In the 70s, the focus shifted to sabotage training. So-called sleeper cells and caches of weapons and equipment were created in NATO countries. The logic of the Cold War dictated the need to be ready for H hour. If the Cold War turned into a hot one, Special Reserve fighters were to be activated deep behind enemy lines, sowing chaos and panic. They studied the subway schemes of Paris and London, knew the vulnerable points of dams in Germany and the nodal stations of power grids in the USA. These were shadow people, living among potential adversaries for years, ready to turn into saboteurs at a single signal. The psychological tension of such a life is difficult to overestimate. Not everyone could live with the awareness that they were a living bomb awaiting a detonator. At the ideological level, the conflict was even deeper. The Soviet Union positioned itself as a bulwark of humanism and world peace. Official propaganda condemned imperialist predators and their methods. But the existence of the 13th Department created a monstrous paradox. A state proclaiming the brightest ideals maintained a structure engaged in the darkest craft. This cognitive dissonance corroded the system from within. Many intelligence officers, highly educated individuals who knew foreign languages and had visited the West, began to ask questions. They saw the discrepancy between the slogans in the newspaper Pravda and the real orders they received. The justification, "the end justifies the means," worked as long as there was faith in a great goal. But in the era of stagnation, when ideology turned into ritual and faith faded, only naked professionalism and fear remained. Fear of the system, of which they were a part, and fear of what the system could do to them. After all, an eliminator who knows too much becomes an ideal target himself. The turning point when it became clear that old methods were beginning to do more harm than good was precisely the operation against Georgy Markov. Technically, it was executed masterfully, but the political consequences proved catastrophic. The trail led to Sofia and Moscow. The Western press exploded. The image of the Soviet Union as an empire of evil received, perhaps, its most vivid confirmation. The umbrella, that harmless, everyday object, became a symbol of KGB cunning. After this incident, the intelligence leadership became even more reluctant to sanction direct physical eliminations on the territory of Western countries. The risks of exposure and subsequent diplomatic isolation became too high. At this point, the methods of the department transformed. The focus shifted to developing countries where control was weaker, and to other hands, using proxy groups and training friendly regimes. One of the most dramatic episodes in the history of state security special forces, which vividly demonstrates the power and tragedy of these people, was the storming of Amin's palace in Afghanistan on December 27, 1979. Operation #5 became the apotheosis of the KGB's power structures. Fighters from the Zenit and Grom groups, formed from special reserve officers, were to eliminate the head of a foreign state in his own well-fortified residence. It was a task that seemed impossible. The Tajbeg Palace stood on a high hill. The approaches to it were mined and swept by gunfire. Amin's guard consisted of hundreds of loyal guards. But the Soviet saboteurs did it. In 43 minutes of assault, they broke the resistance and completed the task. Hafizullah Amin was eliminated. However, the cost of victory and the very nature of this operation revealed the profound horror of the fighters' situation. During the assault, they were forced to shoot at everything that moved. In the chaos of battle, not only enemies but also their own were killed. Doctors who were trying to save Amin from poisoning, which was the first attempt at elimination, organized by the same department, also came under fire. Special Forces soldiers, many of whom were intelligent people with higher education who had completed officer training courses, found themselves in the role of butchers. Upon their return, many of them did not receive the promised awards, or their participation was so classified that they could not even tell their loved ones where they had been injured. The storming of Amin's palace became a triumph of tactics and a catastrophe of strategy, drawing the USSR into a 10-year war that ultimately undermined the foundation of the power itself. This episode showed that the sharp sword of the party could be effective, but it could not solve political problems. Violence only begot more violence. As the end of the 1980s approached and perestroika began, the atmosphere around the department started to change. Glasnost lifted the veil of secrecy over Stalin's repressions, and society learned with horror about the scale of past crimes. The the shadows of the past began to thicken over the present. Employees involved in specific operations found themselves in a vacuum. Their skills, which were in demand by the state just yesterday, now seemed compromising. The era of grand cover-ups began. Shredders buzzed in the depths of archives, and folders with operational development cases blazed in furnaces. Formulas for poisons, schemes for caches, and agents' receipts were destroyed. The system tried to cleanse its conscience, or at least its biography, in the face of inevitable changes. The culmination of the 13th Department's history can be considered the collapse of the Soviet Union. The structure, created to protect a monolithic state, proved powerless against the internal disintegration of that state. Masters of secret operations, capable of eliminating any person anywhere in the world, could not stop the course of history. In August 1991, many of them faced a choice: whom to serve. An oath was given to one country, but completely different ones appeared on the map. Some went into the private sector, becoming heads of security services for banks and corporations, applying their skills of protection and observation in a new, capitalist world. Others remained in service, trying to preserve the professional core in conditions of total lack of money and the chaos of the 90s. Still others, unable to withstand the collapse of ideals, left the country or passed away. Paradoxically, it was precisely at the moment of collapse, when secrecy began to crumble, that the world learned the true scale of these people's activities. Defectors, such as Oleg Gordievsky and Vasily Mitrokhin, smuggled thousands of pages of secret documents to the West. The Mitrokhin archive became a real ticking time bomb. It contained detailed descriptions of weapons caches in Europe and the USA, names of agents, and details of operations that were considered perfectly clean. It turned out that the hand of Moscow was longer and more sophisticated than even the boldest conspiracy theorists could have imagined. This revelation became the final chord in the Cold War, but it also raised new questions. If such a powerful machine existed, where did its potential go? Knowledge and technology do not disappear without a trace. The resonance of the 13th Department's activities is felt even today, decades after the USSR disappeared from the map. We live in a world where the lines between war and peace are blurred, and the methods of hybrid warfare resemble strategies developed precisely in those closed offices. The use of neurotoxins, cyber attacks on infrastructure, information psychological operations, all of these are direct or indirect heirs of the quote one of the stagnation era. The lesson this story teaches us is not about moralizing about good and evil, but about understanding the nature of power and the state's tools. Any superpower striving for dominance inevitably creates structures operating beyond the law. The only question is the degree of control and how far the state is willing to go for its interests. The history of wet affairs shows that the physical elimination of an opponent is always a sign of weakness, not strength. When arguments are exhausted, poison is used. But poison has the property of poisoning not only the victim, but also the one who uses it. A society that allows extrajudicial killings as a method of state policy inevitably corrodes its own moral foundations. Today's news headlines, reporting mysterious poisonings and inexplicable incidents involving defectors, force us to recall those who honed this craft half a century ago. The methods have become more technological, the poisons less noticeable, but the essence remains the same. The shadow of the 13th Department still falls upon the modern world of intelligence. This is a reminder that there are doors best left unopened, and secrets that the state will guard at any cost. Returning to the image of the man on Waterloo Bridge, we understand that he was not just a victim, but a symbol of an era when human life was a small change in a large geopolitical game. And as long as there are states with global ambitions, the masters of quiet solutions will likely not disappear. They will simply change department names, rewrite instructions, and dissolve into a new crowd, remaining invisible until someone again feels a slight prick. Like an insect bite. This continuity of methods makes us ponder the nature of secret services in general. After all, the 13th Department was not a unique phenomenon in a vacuum. Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA and MI6, also had their units for, quote, zero, quote, assassination attempts on Fidel Castro, organized by American intelligence, sometimes rivaled KGB plans in their ingenuity and absurdity. Poisoned cigars, exploding mollusks, the imagination of liquidators knew no bounds on both sides of the ocean. However, the Soviet system was distinguished by its bureaucratic thoroughness. Murder was elevated to the rank of a state procedure, with signatures, seals, and planned targets. It was an industry of death, embedded in a planned economy. It is this banality of evil, when discussing the method of eliminating a person, occurred in the same offices and with the same intonation as discussing a harvest plan, that makes the story of the 13th Department so terrifying. The role of science in this activity deserves special attention. The laboratory, providing the department with special means, worked at the forefront of chemistry and toxicology. Scientists, people in white coats, who had taken the Hippocratic Oath or its Soviet equivalents, dedicated their lives to creating substances that kill without a trace. Organofluorine compounds, carbylamine chloride, ricin, thallium. These names sounded like music within the walls of the laboratory. The task was not just to kill, but to simulate illness. This required the deepest understanding of human physiology. For example, how to induce symptoms of myocardial infarction that would look absolutely natural upon autopsy. How to provoke pulmonary edema in a person thousands of kilometers away. This scientific quest, perverted by the goals of the special services, nevertheless led to discoveries. Paradoxically, some developments in toxicology later found application in medicine, but for saving lives. However, the main goal remained the same: to create the ideal weapon, a weapon that cannot be identified. The geography of the department's operations was truly global. If Europe was a field of subtle play, in third world countries they acted more crudely. Africa, Asia, Latin America, everywhere Soviet and US interests clashed, invisible fighters were present. They trained local rebels, organized sabotage on oil pipelines, eliminated objectionable tribal chiefs. In many local conflicts of the second half of the 20th century, one can find the trace of Soviet advisors on special issues. But Europe remained the main stage. Vienna, Berlin, Paris were filled with spies. Berlin, divided by a wall, was the true capital of espionage. Exchanges of agents took place here. Kidnappings were planned here. There are known cases when people were transported from West Berlin to East in the trunks of diplomatic cars, or sedated right on the street. The operation to extract or eliminate a traitor required the coordination of dozens of people: external surveillance, an arrest team, a cover team, technical support. It was a complex ballet where one mistake could cost all participants their freedom. Within the KGB itself, attitudes towards the department's employees were ambivalent. On the one hand, there was respect and fear. Everyone understood that these people did the dirtiest and most dangerous work. On the other hand, there was a certain squeamishness from the quote, _0 intelligence officers, analysts, and diplomats who preferred to work with white gloves. Quote 1 were considered a necessary but unpleasant bodily function, something like an excretory system, not to be spoken of in polite society. The department's employees themselves often formed a closed caste. They communicated mostly with each other, and their families often vacationed together in closed sanatoriums. This circle of initiates was bound by a common secret and common blood. It was almost impossible to leave this circle. Entry costs a ruble, exit costs 2, as the grim saying of the time went. Retirement did not mean freedom from secrecy. Former liquidators remained under the unofficial supervision of their colleagues until the end of their days. The aspect of recruitment into this unit is also interesting. They didn't take people off the street. Candidates were sought in other KGB departments, in Army Special Forces, among sport shooters and martial arts masters. They looked not just for physically strong people, but for those who possessed psychological stability and a willingness to cross moral barriers. During training, cadets were subjected to the most severe trials. They were taught to survive in any conditions, to master any weapon, to operate any vehicle. But most importantly, they were taught not to feel guilt. Psychological conditioning methods allowed them to block empathy at the moment of carrying out a task. A person was transformed into a function. However, after completing the task, the quote 3 often returned, leading to severe consequences. Psychological rehabilitation of employees was poorly developed. Most often, stress was relieved in the traditional Russian way, with vodka. Alcoholism was an occupational disease for many veterans of the Secret War. One cannot help but mention how the perception of the department's activities changed over time. In the 1960s, amidst the romanticism of intelligence fueled by films and books, work in the special services seemed heroic. But by the end of the 1970s, as the entire Soviet system stagnated, cynicism permeated the ranks of the Chekists as well. Faith in the communist future faded, giving way to careerism and a desire to secure material well-being. Trips abroad, access to scarce goods, currency, all of this became a powerful motivator. Ideological fervor was replaced by cold calculation. The elimination of an enemy of the state simply became a difficult job for which one was well paid and received stars on one's shoulders. This hollowing out of meaning made the system vulnerable. A person working for money and privileges is more easily subverted than a fanatic. And Western intelligence services understood this perfectly, beginning an active hunt for the souls of Soviet intelligence officers. One of the most enigmatic aspects of the 13th Department's activities remains the cases that were never solved. History knows only the tip of the iceberg, failures or betrayals. But how many successful operations remained in the shadows? How many deaths, attributed to heart attacks, strokes, and accidents, were actually the result of the work of professionals from Lubyanka? Intelligence historians believe the number could be in the hundreds. These were politicians, journalists, scientists, and military personnel in various countries around the world whose activities hindered the interests of the USSR. Their sudden departures from life changed political alignments, disrupted contracts, and halted scientific projects. This was an invisible intervention into the fabric of reality, a real-time correction of history. We will never know the full lists, as many documents were destroyed, and witnesses remain silent. Silence is a currency in the world of special services that does not depreciate with time. Even today, As we look at modern conflicts, we see echoes of that school. The concept of, quote, zero, so often discussed by military experts, largely relies on the developments of Soviet strategists of, quote, one, the ability to destabilize an adversary from within without resorting to open invasion, to sow chaos, fear, and distrust. This is an art that was honed for decades. The 13th Department was a pioneer in this field. They understood earlier than others that information and fear could be more destructive weapons than a nuclear bomb. To kill one to frighten millions. This formula of terror was rethought and put at the service of the state. And although the name, quote, two, has long disappeared from staffing tables, the philosophy of this unit has dissolved into the DNA of modern security structures. Ultimately, the history of the quote, three masters is a story about the boundaries of the human and the state. Where does the defense of national interests end and crime begin? Does the state have the right to assume the functions of God, deciding who lives and who dies? In the era of stagnation, the answer to this question was unequivocal. The interests of the state were paramount. Man was a cog, a consumable. Both victims and executioners were hostages of this coordinate system. Today, looking back, we can condemn these methods, be horrified by the cynicism and cruelty. But we must not forget that this was part of our history, part of that global drama of the 20th century that shaped our modern world. Without understanding these dark pages, the picture of the past will be incomplete. Concluding this excursion into the world of shadows, I want to return to where we started. An ordinary person on the street, rushing about their business. They don't think about big politics, about intelligence and counterintelligence. They just live their lives. But somewhere nearby, in a parallel world, there are people whose job is to observe, analyze, and, if ordered, to act. This invisible front has not disappeared. It has only transformed, adapted to new technologies and new realities. And perhaps right now, as you read these lines, somewhere in a quiet office, a decision is being made that will change someone's fate. The history of the 13th Department teaches us that reality is always more complex and dangerous than it seems at first glance, and that behind the facade of diplomatic smiles and peace treaties, there is always the sharp edge of a sword, ready to strike at any moment. Silence can be deceptive, and security illusory. This, perhaps, is the main lesson bequeathed to us by the most closed structure of the most closed country of the 20th century.